He turned a small family bakery into a household name, built an empire out of flour, fondant, and pure stubborn will, and became one of the most recognizable faces in reality television. But behind the icing and the cameras, Buddy Valastro's life has been anything but sweet and simple. There was heartbreak before the fame even started. There was a freak accident that nearly cost him the one thing his entire career depended on. And there were personal missteps that played out in front of millions of viewers. So what actually happened to the cake boss? Let's go back to the beginning. Bartolo Buddy Valastro Jr. was born in 1977 in Hoboken, New Jersey, the youngest child and only son in a household of 5 kids. His parents, Bartolo Sr. and Mary Valastro, were Italian immigrants who ran a small neighborhood bakery called Carlo's, which Bartolo Sr. had purchased back in the 1960s. For the Valastro family, the bakery wasn't just a source of income. It was the center of gravity around which everything else revolved. Holidays, weekends, arguments, celebrations, all of it happened with flour on the counters and the smell of pastry in the air. Buddy grew up surrounded by 4 older sisters, and from a young age he gravitated toward the bakery rather than away from it. While other neighborhood kids were outside playing, Buddy was inside learning how to roll dough and pipe icing, often before he was even a teenager. By the time he was 11, he was already working shifts at Carlo's, absorbing techniques from his father that most people wouldn't pick up until years of formal training. Baking wasn't a chore to him. It was something closer to a language he was fluent in before he even realized it. That early apprenticeship became the foundation for everything that followed, but it also came with an expiration date nobody saw coming. In the mid-1990s, when Buddy was still a teenager, his father was diagnosed with lung cancer. The disease moved quickly, and within a relatively short window of time, the man who had taught Buddy everything about the business was gone. Buddy was 17 years old, and suddenly the bakery, along with the responsibility of keeping it alive, landed entirely on his shoulders. There was no gradual transition into leadership. Buddy didn't have a college degree, a business background, or years of managerial experience to lean on. What he had was a promise he'd made to his father in his final days, that he would take Carlo's Bakery and turn it into something bigger than a neighborhood shop, something people across the country would recognize. Keeping that promise meant years of grinding work that most people never saw. Long nights, early mornings, learning payroll and inventory and customer service on the fly, all while trying to keep the quality of the cakes high enough to justify the family name on the sign outside. Slowly, that effort started to pay off. Buddy's cake designs began catching attention in bridal magazines, and brides looking for elaborate, story-driven wedding cakes started seeking out Carlo's specifically. His style was bold. Big sculptural pieces, intricate sugar work, cakes that looked more like art installations than desserts. That reputation eventually reached the Food Network, and in the mid-2000s, Buddy appeared on one of their baking competition specials. It was a small moment in the grand scheme of his career, but it mattered because it put him on television for the first time, and it showed producers something they hadn't quite captured before: a young guy running a chaotic, deeply Italian, deeply emotional family business, who also happened to be an extraordinarily talented baker. That combination, talent plus family drama plus authenticity, was exactly the kind of thing reality television was hungry for. In 2009, Cake Boss premiered on TLC, and it became a hit almost immediately. The show worked because it wasn't really about cake. It was about a family. Viewers met Buddy's sisters, his brothers-in-law, the longtime staff at the bakery, and watched them argue, joke around, panic over deadlines, and pull off increasingly outrageous cake designs under intense time pressure. It felt unscripted and lived in, which is exactly what set it apart from more polished cooking competition formats. The show's success snowballed fast. It aired in dozens of countries, dubbed and subtitled for international audiences, and Buddy went from being a well-regarded local baker to an internationally known personality. Back in Hoboken, the original bakery transformed almost overnight from a quiet neighborhood storefront into a tourist destination, with lines forming outside just so people could see the place they recognized from television. Buddy didn't sit back and let the fame do the work for him. He expanded aggressively, opening additional bakery locations across the United States and eventually overseas. He launched a full-service Italian restaurant in Las Vegas built around his mother's recipes, and later a faster, more casual pizza and dessert concept as well. He moved into retail too, putting his name on cake decorating tools, bakeware, and mixes sold in major retail chains, and he released cookbooks that combined recipes with family history. Television kept expanding around him as well. Spin-off shows followed one after another. Competition formats where aspiring bakers vied for a spot on his team, a family-style cooking show built around home recipes, a series where he traveled to help struggling bakeries get back on their feet, and eventually a head-to-head competition format pairing him against fellow television baker Duff Goldman. Each new show carried a version of the same appeal that made the original series work. High stakes, tight deadlines, and a family constantly navigating both business pressure and personal dynamics in front of the camera. Through all of it, Buddy tried to keep the operation family run. His sisters remained heavily involved. His wife Lisa played a steadying role behind the scenes, even as she occasionally appeared on camera. And as his children got older, they too began showing up in later seasons, echoing the same mentorship dynamic Buddy had once experienced with his own father. By 2020, Buddy had spent more than a decade as one of the most visible bakers in the world. Then, in September of that year, everything nearly came apart in his own home. The Valastro family had a home bowling alley, and during a routine attempt to fix a jammed pin resetting machine, disaster struck. While reaching into the mechanism, a metal rod violently punctured his dominant right hand and trapped it inside the machine. His teenage sons were home at the time and rushed to help, eventually using a power saw to cut through the machinery and free him. By the time paramedics got him to a hospital, the damage to his hand was severe: crushed bones, damaged nerves, tissue that would need extensive reconstruction. Over the following months, Buddy underwent multiple surgeries to rebuild the hand, with doctors working to repair tendons and restore as much function as possible. But the physical trauma was only part of the story. For a man whose entire identity and livelihood depended on the fine motor skills of his hands, the psychological toll was arguably just as brutal. He would later describe the fear that gripped him during recovery, the sense that without full use of his hands, the identity he had spent his whole life building might simply disappear. The rehabilitation process was slow and demanding. Basic movements that had once been second nature, gripping a piping bag, holding a spatula steady, had to be relearned almost from scratch. There were setbacks along the way, moments where it wasn't clear whether he'd ever regain the precision his craft required. But he kept showing up to physical therapy, kept pushing, and leaned on his family for support throughout. By late 2021, Buddy reported that he had recovered roughly 95% of the function in his dominant hand, enough to return to decorating cakes and running his business, even if some fine motor tasks remained more difficult than they once were. The accident reshaped more than his hand. By his own account, it changed how he thought about time, mortality, and what actually mattered. He became noticeably more selective about which projects he took on and more intentional about how he spent his time, both in business and with his family. Buddy's journey through fame wasn't only defined by triumph and tragedy on a physical level. It also included very public personal stumbles that tested his image as the wholesome, family-first star of a hit TV show. Long before any of that played out publicly, Buddy had quietly struggled with anxiety. He's spoken about experiencing a severe panic attack in his late 20s, serious enough that he ended up in an emergency room, at a point when the pressure of running a rapidly growing business empire, while starring in multiple television shows and raising young children, had become overwhelming. Talking openly about that experience later on helped humanize him for a lot of fans who were dealing with similar pressures in their own lives, even if they weren't running a baking empire. Then came a more public controversy in 2014, when Buddy was pulled over and arrested for driving under the influence in New York City after police noticed his vehicle swerving. The arrest generated significant media attention, given how closely his public persona was tied to family values, and it led to public backlash along with a formal apology from Buddy in the days that followed. He later described the incident as a genuine wake-up call, one that pushed him to re-evaluate certain habits and think more carefully about the example he was setting for his kids. A few years earlier, in 2012, Cake Boss had also found itself at the center of a different kind of controversy, when an episode built around a prank involving model and television personality Carmen Carrera drew sharp criticism for how it handled her identity as a transgender woman. Carrera publicly expressed hurt over how she'd been portrayed, the segment was pulled, and Buddy issued a public apology. It became something of a turning point for the show in terms of how it approached similar storylines going forward. Not every storyline in Buddy's public life turned sour, though. His long-rumored rivalry with fellow baking personality Duff Goldman, built up over years by media coverage pitting the two men against each other, eventually softened into mutual respect after they competed head-to-head on a televised baking competition. What had been framed as a bitter feud turned out to be more complicated. Two people who respected each other's skill, even while approaching the craft very differently. Perhaps the heaviest personal loss Buddy faced during his years in the spotlight came in 2017, when his mother, Mary Valastro, passed away after a long battle with ALS. She had been a beloved presence on Cake Boss for years, known to fans simply as Mama Mary, and her death left a visible mark on both the show and Buddy personally. Having already lost his father as a teenager, losing his mother added another layer of weight to how he talked about legacy and family in the years that followed. Given everything, the injury, the public controversies, the grief, it would have been reasonable to expect Buddy to quietly step back from the spotlight. Instead, he leaned into a new chapter built around passing the torch rather than holding onto it alone. In 2023, he launched a new series centered less on spectacle and more on succession, giving viewers a closer look at how the next generation of the Valastro family was stepping into the business. His children began taking on larger, more visible roles, learning the trade from the ground up in much the same way Buddy had once learned it from his own father. The business itself has also evolved considerably in recent years. Several physical bakery locations that had opened during the height of the show's popularity have since closed, particularly in markets where in-person foot traffic slowed significantly after the pandemic. Rather than treating those closures as a retreat, Buddy has framed the shift as a deliberate pivot toward a more digital, delivery-first model, with an online store now shipping cakes, pastries, and DIY baking kits directly to customers around the country. At the same time, the brand hasn't abandoned physical retail entirely. In 2024, Carlo's Bakery opened a flagship location in the middle of Times Square, one of the most heavily trafficked spots on the planet, complete with self-serve cake vending machines and a design built to blend old-school Italian bakery charm with a much more modern, social media-friendly aesthetic. Buddy himself continues to manage the lingering effects of his hand injury. Even with the vast majority of function restored, he's been open about certain tasks requiring more effort or assistance than they used to. These days, his role looks noticeably different than it did during the early years of Cake Boss. Less about personally executing every intricate cake design under a ticking clock, and more about mentoring his children, developing new products, and shaping the direction of a business that's now been running, in one form or another, for well over half a century. Strip away the reality show format and the viral cake reveals, and Buddy Valastro's story is really about continuity under pressure. A teenager forced into adulthood by loss, a young man who built something enormous out of a small family shop, and a middle-aged man who nearly lost the use of his hands and rebuilt anyway. Along the way, there were public mistakes he had to own, controversies that forced uncomfortable but necessary reflection, and losses that reshaped how he thought about what he was actually building toward. What seems to have carried him through all of it isn't some singular comeback moment, but a repeated willingness to adapt, to rebuild a bakery after his father's death, to rebuild his hand after the accident, to rebuild his public image after his own missteps, and now to rebuild the business itself for a generation that grew up ordering things online instead of walking into a storefront. The cakes made him famous, but it's that pattern of getting knocked down and finding a way back up that seems to be the actual through line of his story. Would you want to see more of Buddy Valastro's journey covered? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this one, check out the next video on your screen.